Dad perfect events. I walked into my rental property at 12:30 p.m. and found my wife Linda in bed with my son-in-law Carlos. The security camera I'd installed to monitor the renovation work had captured everything. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part came an hour later when I discovered they'd been planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so they could steal my hidden fortune. My name is Gary Mitchell. I'm 58 years old, and I thought I knew everything about betrayal after 38 years working in warehouses. Turns out, I didn't know anything. That Tuesday started normal enough. I'd been retired for 3 years from my job as a warehouse supervisor, making $2,100 a month in pension. Linda still worked at First National Bank as a loan officer, pulling in $3,600 monthly. We lived comfortable in our modest 2-story house on Elm Street. Nothing fancy, just the way I liked it. I'd been doing property maintenance work to keep busy, mostly small jobs for rental properties around town. The place on Oak Avenue needed some electrical work checked, and I'd installed cameras to monitor the contractors. Good thing too, because that's how I caught them. I pulled up to the property around noon, planning to check on the wiring progress. The cameras were recording to my phone app, something Linda didn't know about. When I opened the footage from the bedroom, there they were. My wife of 28 years and Carlos Rivera, my daughter Rachel's husband of 6 years. They weren't just having some quick affair either. This looked comfortable, familiar, like they'd been doing this for months. Linda was laughing at something Carlos said, running her fingers through his hair the way she used to do with me, back when she still touched me. I sat in my truck outside that house for 20 minutes, watching the footage replay on my phone. Carlos was supposed to be at his electrical job across town. Linda was supposed to be at the bank. Instead, they were in my rental property, in the bed I'd helped move in. There last month, the smart thing would have been to storm inside and confront them. The old Gary might have done that, but something told me to wait, to think, to gather more information first. Good thing I listened to that voice. I drove home and started going through Linda's things. Found her second phone hidden in her jewelry box. The text messages told the whole story. This affair had been going on for 8 months, but the texts from last week made my blood run cold. Gary's getting more suspicious, Linda had written. We need to move faster on the plan. Carlos replied, Rachel's already filled out the paperwork for Sunset Manor. Says it costs $4,200 monthly, but she thinks Gary has some savings. He does. More than they know. Once he's safely tucked away, we can be together and access everything. Sunset Manor was the most expensive assisted living facility in our county. They were planning to have me committed so they could control my finances and run off together. My own daughter was involved. See, what none of them knew was that my Uncle Harold had left me $4.5 million when he died 5 years ago. I'd invested it carefully, never told Linda, never changed our lifestyle. The account was now worth $6.1 million. I kept living on my pension because I wanted to know if people loved Gary the warehouse guy, not Gary the millionaire. Now I had my answer. I spent that evening reading through months of text messages between Linda and Carlos. The progression was sickening. It started with complaints about their marriages, moved to secret meetings, then escalated to planning my removal from the picture entirely. Gary's so predictable, Linda had written in March. Same routine every day. He'll never suspect anything. Rachel thinks he's getting forgetful, Carlos had replied. Maybe we can use that. How? Make it seem worse than it is. Get her worried enough to consider assisted living. They'd been planning this for months. Every concerned look from Linda when I misplaced my keys, every suggestion from Carlos about taking it easy in retirement, every conversation with Rachel about my confusion, it was all calculated manipulation. The worst part was reading how they talked about Rachel. My daughter wasn't their willing accomplice. She was another victim of Carlos's manipulation. Rachel's too trusting, Carlos had texted. She believes everything I tell her about Gary's behavior. Yesterday I told her he threatened me over the phone. She immediately started researching memory care facilities. You're horrible, Linda had replied, but effective. She loves her dad. She'll do anything to keep him safe, even if it means putting him somewhere he doesn't want to be. They were using Rachel's love for me as a weapon against both of us. I found receipts too. Linda had been spending money on new clothes, expensive dinners, weekend trips she claimed were work conferences, all paid for with our joint account, while she was planning to abandon me in a nursing home. There were photos on her hidden phone as well, pictures of her and Carlos at restaurants I couldn't afford on my pension, hotel rooms during their afternoon meetings, vacation spots they were researching for their future together. But the most damning evidence was a document Carlos had forwarded to Linda. It was a financial assessment form for Sunset Manor, filled out with estimates of my assets. They'd guessed I had maybe $50,000 in savings, plus the value of our house. They planned to sell everything to pay for my care while they disappeared to start fresh. The irony was perfect. They were destroying their lives and mine for what they thought was maybe $150,000 total, while sitting on top of over $6 million they didn't even know existed. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Janet Peterson. She specialized in divorce cases and had a reputation for being thorough. When I showed her the photos, videos, and text messages, her eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "Gary," she said, "this is the most clear-cut case of adultery and conspiracy I've seen in 20 years. With this evidence and your hidden assets being separate property, we can make sure Linda gets exactly what she deserves, which is nothing. Well, whatever personal belongings she can carry. But I wasn't ready to file divorce papers yet. I needed more evidence, more documentation of their conspiracy. Janet advised me to be patient, methodical. The more evidence we have, the stronger our position becomes. I spent the next week living a double life. During the day, I was Gary, the retired warehouse supervisor, puttering around the house, running errands, maintaining the fiction that I was the same trusting husband I'd always been. But when Linda left for work and Carlos was supposedly at his job sites, I became something else entirely. I installed recording devices throughout our house. In our state, one-party consent laws meant I could legally record conversations in my own home. I placed tiny digital recorders behind picture frames, under tables, anywhere they might have private conversations. The cameras at the rental property captured 3 more afternoon meetings between Linda and Carlos that week. Each session was documented, time-stamped, saved to my private cloud account that Linda had no access to. I also started following them. Sounds paranoid, I know, but I needed to understand the full scope of their relationship. They met at different locations around town. A motel on Highway 9, the parking lot behind the old Sears building, even once at Carlos's electrical supply warehouse after hours. During one of these surveillance sessions, I overheard a phone conversation that made my stomach turn. Carlos was talking to someone, presumably another man, laughing about the situation. "Man, you should see this old guy," Carlos said. "Gary's so clueless, it's almost sad. Yesterday I helped him fix his fence, and he thanked me for being such a good son-in-law. Meanwhile, I'm screwing his wife 3 times a week." "What about Rachel?" the other voice asked. "What about her? She's useful for now. Once we get Gary committed and access his accounts, Rachel won't matter anymore. Linda and I will be long gone." "Sounds cold, man. Business is business. That old warehouse supervisor thinks he's got maybe 50 grand saved up. Once we control that money and sell his house, we'll have enough to disappear to Mexico or somewhere. Start fresh." Mexico. They weren't just planning to abandon me and Rachel. They were planning to flee the country with what they thought was my life savings. That evening, Linda brought Carlos to our house while I was supposedly at my weekly poker game. I was actually parked around the corner, listening through the recording devices on my phone app. "The evaluation appointment is set for next Tuesday," Linda said. "Dr. Williams thinks it's routine depression and memory issues related to retirement adjustment. And Rachel bought it? Completely. She's convinced Gary is showing early signs of dementia. Yesterday she asked me if we should hide the car keys because she's worried about his driving. They both laughed at that. My own wife and son-in-law, laughing about manipulating my daughter into believing her father was losing his mind." "What about the financial stuff?" Carlos asked. "I've been going through his papers. Found some old investment statements, but they're small amounts. Maybe $15,000 in an old 401k, another $20,000 in some mutual funds. The house is worth about $180,000, so after we pay for his care the first year, there should be enough left for us to make a clean start. A year? What happens after that? Not our problem anymore. By then we'll be in Cancun or Puerto Vallarta, and Gary will be the state's responsibility." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. They weren't just stealing from me. They were planning to abandon me to die alone in a nursing home I couldn't afford, while they lived it up on the beach with money they stole. The recording devices paid off in other ways, too. I captured Linda making calls to real estate agents, asking about quick sale procedures and market values for homes in our neighborhood. She was already planning to put our house on the market before I was even committed. I also recorded Carlos coaching Rachel on what symptoms to report to the evaluation doctor. He was feeding her specific stories about my supposed memory lapses, anger outbursts, and confusion about basic daily tasks. None of it was true, but Rachel believed every word because she trusted her husband. Your dad seemed really confused yesterday when I asked him about the garage door repair, Carlos told Rachel during one of their recorded conversations. He couldn't remember calling the repair company, even though we talked about it the day before. That's not like him, Rachel said, worry clear in her voice. Dad's always been so detail-oriented. Memory issues can start small. That's why we need to act now before it gets worse. The manipulation was masterful and disgusting. Carlos was systematically destroying Rachel's faith in my mental competency while positioning himself as the concerned son-in-law just trying to help. But the most damaging evidence came from a conversation between Linda and Carlos 3 nights before their planned intervention. They were in our bedroom discussing the final details of their scheme. Once Gary's committed and the house is sold, how long before we can access everything? Linda asked. My buddy at the bank says maybe 6 months if we do it right. We'll need power of attorney, which Rachel will help us get since she thinks it's for Gary's own good. And then we disappear. New names, cash withdrawals, one-way tickets to paradise. They had thought of everything except the possibility that their victim might be smarter and richer than they imagined. The next day, Rachel came to visit. My daughter looked nervous, fidgeting with her purse like she used to do as a kid when she was about to lie about breaking something. Dad, she said, settling into the living room chair, I've been worried about you lately. You seem forgetful, maybe a little angry sometimes. I think we should talk about getting you some help. I watched my daughter carefully. Rachel was 30 years old, a dental hygienist with her own life and responsibilities. But sitting there in my living room, she looked like that scared little girl who used to run to me when she had nightmares. What kind of help, honey? Well, there's this nice place called Sunset Manor. They have activities and medical care, and I think you'd really like it there. My own daughter, sitting in my living room, in the house I'd worked 38 years to pay for, trying to convince me to sign myself into a nursing home so her husband could run off with her mother. Rachel, I said gently, who put this idea in your head? Nobody put it in my head, Dad. I'm just concerned about you. Is Carlos concerned too? She blushed. We both are. Mom is too. We all want what's best for you. I could see the genuine worry in her eyes. She really believed I was declining, really thought she was helping me. Carlos had done his job well, feeding her just enough manufactured evidence to make her question my mental state without making her suspicious of his motives. Rachel, has Carlos told you about specific incidents where I seemed confused? Well, yes, like last week when you couldn't remember calling the garage door repair company. And Carlos said you threatened him over the phone, which isn't like you at all. I never called any repair company, honey. The garage door works fine. And I definitely never threatened Carlos. Rachel looked confused, but Carlos said a lot of things. Have you ever witnessed any of these incidents yourself? She paused, thinking. Well, no, but Carlos wouldn't lie about something like that. Wouldn't he? That evening, I made copies of everything. Photos, recordings, financial documents, text messages. Janet had advised me to prepare for war, and war was coming. The confrontation happened on a Saturday evening. I'd invited Linda, Carlos, and Rachel over for dinner, made Linda's favorite pot roast, set the table nice, even bought wine. They came thinking they were going to convince me to tour Sunset Manor the next week. Instead, I served them the truth. Before we eat, I said, I have something to show you all. I turned on the TV and connected my laptop. The security camera footage from the rental property filled the screen. Linda's face went white. Carlos started to stand up, then sat back down. Rachel looked confused. Dad, what is this? This is your mother and your husband having an affair for the past 8 months. Rachel stared at the screen, watching her husband kiss her mother passionately in what they thought was a private moment. This can't be real. It's real, honey, but that's not all. I played the audio, recording from 2 nights ago, their voices filling our dining room as they plan my future imprisonment. Once Gary's committed and the house is sold. How long before we can access everything? Linda's recorded voice asked. Carlos's voice replied, My buddy at the bank says maybe 6 months if we do it right. Rachel's face crumpled as she listened to her husband and mother, casually discussing my disposal like I was an inconvenient piece of furniture. We need to put Gary somewhere he can't interfere with our plans, Linda's voice continued on the recording. Mom, how could you? Rachel whispered, tears starting to flow. Rachel, this isn't what it looks like, Linda started. It's exactly what it looks like, I said. You've been planning to have me declared incompetent, steal my assets, and abandon me in a nursing home while you run off to Mexico together. Carlos finally spoke up, his voice shaky. Gary, maybe we can work something out. Can we, like the way you worked out sleeping? With my wife while married to my daughter? Dad, Rachel said, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know about Mom and Carlos. I swear I only called Sunset Manor because Carlos said you were getting confused, maybe dangerous. Dangerous to who, Rachel? Dangerous to their plan to steal my money and disappear to another country? That's when I pulled out the financial documents, bank statements, investment records, property deeds, numbers that made Linda gasp out loud. $6.1 million, I said quietly. That's what you didn't know about your husband, Linda. That's what Carlos didn't know about his father-in-law. The silence was deafening. Carlos stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. His electrical worker's salary was $47,000 a year. He'd been planning to destroy multiple lives for what he thought was maybe $200,000 total, while sitting at the table with someone worth more than he'd make in a lifetime. $6 million? Rachel whispered. Uncle Harold left. Me $4.5 million 5 years ago. I invested it conservatively, never told anyone, because I wanted to see who loved Gary the warehouse supervisor versus Gary the millionaire. Linda found her voice. That money belongs to both of us. We're married. Actually, inheritance is separate property in this state, provided it's kept in separate accounts. Which it was. Gary, please, Linda said, her voice taking on a pleading tone I hadn't heard in years. We can work through this. Work through what? Your 8-month affair? Your plan to have me committed? Your conspiracy to flee to Mexico with money you planned to steal from me? It wasn't supposed to go this far, Carlos said weakly. How far was it supposed to go? At what point were you going to stop betraying my daughter and planning my destruction? None of them had an answer for that. Here's what's going to happen, I continued, my voice calm and steady. Linda, you're filing for divorce. You'll get whatever the law says you deserve for adultery, which is basically nothing. Carlos, you're moving out of Rachel's house today. Rachel, you get to decide if you want to repair our relationship or side with the people who betrayed both of us. The divorce proceedings took 4 months. Janet was ruthless and methodical. She presented every piece of evidence we'd gathered, the security footage, the recorded conversations, the text messages planning my commitment, the financial conspiracy, even the Mexico escape plan. Linda hired Paul Stevens, a family attorney who specialized in protecting wives' assets in divorce cases. But even Stevens looked uncomfortable when Janet methodically laid out the evidence of adultery and conspiracy. Your client forfeited any claim to spousal support when she decided to sleep with her son-in-law and plot to have my client declared incompetent, Janet told Stevens during our first settlement conference. My client's actions were born out of genuine concern for Mr. Mitchell's mental state, Stevens replied. Weakly. Documented by whom? What medical professional diagnosed Mr. Mitchell with cognitive issues? What incidents were reported to justify these concerns? Stevens fell silent. There were no medical reports, no documented incidents, no professional assessments. Linda's claims about my mental state were fabricated to support their plan. Furthermore, Janet continued, my client has documentation showing that your client and Mr. Rivera made inquiries about selling the marital home, while my client was supposedly being evaluated for residential care. Please explain how that represents genuine concern for his welfare. The settlement was as brutal as Janet had promised. Linda got $8,200 from our joint checking account, her personal belongings, and her car. Everything else, the house, my retirement accounts, my investment portfolios, all of the inheritance, remained mine. She was also responsible for her own legal fees, which exceeded $18,000. Carlos lost his job within 2 weeks of the divorce filing. Word spread quickly through the electrical workers union about what he'd done, Nobody wants to hire someone who can't be trusted around other men's wives. He moved to a cheap apartment across town, picking up day labor when he could find it. Rachel divorced Carlos immediately after our dinner confrontation. She couldn't afford expensive legal representation on her dental hygienist salary, so I quietly paid for her attorney. Carlos's betrayal had destroyed her marriage too, and she deserved justice. The stress of their situation destroyed Linda and Carlos's relationship faster than I'd expected. Love built on betrayal and shared conspiracy doesn't survive real-world problems like unemployment and legal fees and social ostracism. They broke up last week, Janet informed me during one of our final meetings. Linda's working double shifts at the bank and weekends at a retail store just to pay her rent. Carlos is doing odd jobs, living in that studio apartment. Neither of them can afford to leave town, much less flee to Mexico. Rachel moved back into her childhood bedroom while her divorce was finalized. It was awkward at first. We were both dealing with the betrayal, both trying to understand how the people we trusted most had manipulated us. "Dad," she said one evening about 6 months after everything came out, "I keep thinking about all the times Carlos told me you were acting strange, and I believed him without question. Don't torture yourself with what-ifs, honey. Carlos was good at manipulation. He fooled both of us. But I should have talked to you directly. I should have trusted my own judgment instead of believing everything he said." Rachel was right, but she was also a victim of Carlos's emotional abuse. He'd systematically isolated her from friends, convinced her that her own perceptions were unreliable, made her dependent on his version of reality. "I want to go back to school," she said. "Maybe get my degree in dental hygiene education. Instead of just being a technician, teach the next generation. That's expensive. I know. I'd have to take loans, work part-time while studying. It would take 3 years. I considered her request carefully. Rachel needed to rebuild her life independently, prove to herself that she could succeed on her own merits. But she was still my daughter, and Carlos's betrayal had already cost her enough. "What if I make you a loan? Low interest, reasonable repayment terms. You could focus on studies without financial stress." Her eyes filled with tears. "After everything I did, you'd still help me? You were manipulated by someone you trusted. That doesn't make you responsible for his choices." A year after the divorces were finalized, I bought property in the Colorado mountains. 15 acres of pine forest and meadows, with a custom log house that cost $950,000 cash. It was everything I'd dreamed of, but never dared pursue during my working years. Rachel has a cottage on the far side of the property. The physical distance helps us rebuild our relationship without the pressure of forced intimacy. She's excelling in her program at Colorado State University, driving down to Fort Collins 3 days a week for classes. I've discovered a passion for wildlife photography that I never knew I had. The mountains provide endless subjects: elk, deer, hawks, eagles, the changing seasons painting the landscape in different colors. I've even sold some prints to a gallery in Denver, not because I need the money, but because it feels good to have my work valued. The volunteer work at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center connects me with people who share my love of nature. We rescue injured animals, nurse them back to health, release them when they're ready. It's satisfying work that reminds me life can be renewed, even after serious damage. My social circle is small but genuine. Neighbors who move to the mountains for retirement, couples in their 60s and 70s who value authenticity over status. We gather for dinner parties, hiking trips, photography expeditions. I laugh more than I have in years. Patricia, a widow whose husband died 4 years ago, has become a particularly close friend. She got me involved with the Wildlife Center and shares my photography interests. Our relationship is comfortable and honest, built on shared values rather than financial dependency or social expectations. "You seem content," she observed during one of our photography walks through the national forest. I am. For the first time in years, I'm exactly where I want to be. Standing on my deck this morning, watching sunrise paint the mountains gold and pink, I reflected on the complete transformation of my life. The betrayal that seemed like the end of my world became the beginning of my real life. I'm happier alone than I ever was in a marriage built on deception. The mountain solitude I initially feared has become peaceful rather than lonely. I wake when I want, pursue interests Linda never shared, build relationships with people who value authenticity. Gary, the warehouse supervisor, was passive, trusting, willing to accept whatever affection his family offered. This Gary knows his worth, enforces boundaries, refuses to be anyone's victim. The hidden wealth was never really about the money. It was about learning who loved me for myself versus what I could provide. Now I know the difference, and I'll never settle for less again. Sometimes the people who claim to love you are really just loving what they think you can give them. But the ones who love you when they think you have nothing are the ones worth keeping. The best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's building a life so good that their betrayal becomes the greatest gift they ever gave you.